I think we're live now. So in our next session, we're going to talk about breaking the wall of unethical AI, evidence-based and data-informed approach to identifying the root of bias. And we have Keith Plummer here. I am Ari Kamlani. I'm going to be your moderator. So I am with Beyond Limits, as well as with the IEEE. I sit within the CTO office over there, and as well as on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. Keith Plummer is Director of Research and Learning at Feminuity. Keith, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little background on your company and yourself a little bit more?
Of course. Hello, everybody. My name is Keith Plummer. I am the Director of Research and Learning at Feminuity. In my work, I focus primarily on workshop development, product inclusion, comprehensive workplace assessments, and various development of thought leadership. I have undergraduate degrees in sociology and gender and sexuality studies and a master's in comparative social policy. Before coming to Feminuity, I worked in LGBTQ2+ advocacy, first at the Digital Transgender Archive, the first online repository of transgender history, and then at unethical, organization based in the Bay Area of California, dedicated to LGBTQ2+ workplace inclusion. And it's so great to focus broadly on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Feminuity. I find our approach is very intersectional and inclusive, and encompasses far more than simply just gender and sexual diversity. So at Feminuity, we work with organizations to build diverse teams, equitable systems, inclusive products, and thriving workplace cultures. Since 2015, we supported startups through the Fortune 500 organizations to align their good intentions with meaningful and long-term impact. And as a full-service diversity, equity, inclusion consulting firm, our approach is evidence-based, data-informed, and paired with leading practices, which we know are constantly evolving and iterating. We combine our industry expertise, our lived experiences, our team is incredibly diverse as well, and our values to help transform workplaces worldwide. So whether it's through a comprehensive workplace assessment to identify bias or surface new insights, or simply some targeted advisory work around your DEI strategies and practices, or customized webinars and workshops, we are totally down to align your organization with its good intentions and help, bolster and propel diversity, equity, and inclusion at your organization.
Great, nice background. It's great behind the mission statement, right behind Feminuity. I'm interested, from a standpoint of working from startups to large enterprises, right? Do you see like a clear definition used by the industry? Is there even a clear definition of this, or does it totally waver depending on the audience?
Oh, that's such a good question. So just like if something is identifying as a startup or a Fortune 500?
Yeah, do you see it really clear definition between those two different type of audiences, a transition from a startup or a particular industry, and then as you scale further out?
That's a great question. I think Fortune 500, that's usually, determined specifically, by Fortune and who is designating as the Fortune 500. A startup, when does a startup transform beyond the startup? That's a great question. I don't think I have a good and solid answer for that, but I think it's just as it's scaling, perhaps it's joining a larger organization, or it's moved beyond to proof of concept to really trying to implement and grow.
And what do you think about, in terms of the whole DI definition, does Feminuity have a particular view behind it?
Totally. So I feel like we define diversity, equity, and inclusion as distinct but very interrelated and important aspects of a fulsome diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So diversity is about difference. So this is differences in identities, appearances, backgrounds, perspectives. Diversity is about the composition of a group, a team, or an organization. Sometimes folks call people diverse, but we want to move away from that language. People aren't diverse. Everyone is a unique person, but our teams and our organizations must be if we really want to innovate and really want to create sustainable and equitable future. So that is diversity. So that's diversity in all those different characteristics, whether it be sexual orientation, gender identity, racial identity, age, disability, all those different factors. So that's the presence of difference. Inclusion is about people feeling belonged and valued in a given organization or setting. So while you can have people that are different at an organization, they don't necessarily feel that sense of inclusion. You know, they're there, but do they feel like they can thrive? Do they feel supported? Do they feel they can bring their full selves to work? Like, that would be inclusion. Then equity is about the design of our approach. So the difference between equality and equity is simple. Equality means we're treating everyone the same, whereas equity means we're designing for the individual and looking to remove salient barriers that each person faces so they can reach their full potential. So an easy example of equity versus equality maybe would be in terms of company swag. So if we're doing something like t-shirts, equality-inspired design would say, we have a preset number of sizes, small, medium, large, and that's what we're getting for the organization. And hopefully that will work for you. Some people will be able to tuck it in, some people will be able to roll it up, but hopefully that works out. And then equity-inspired design would say, oh, let's actually take size-appropriate t-shirt orders and know what people want. And perhaps shirts aren't even the best swag option to begin with, and there's other swag options we should be considering. So those are like the distinctions between diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I think broadly as a practice, what we're looking for is diversity, equity, inclusion means questioning longstanding inequities in our industry, our teams, certain roles in our organizations, and creating actionable strategies so people of all backgrounds, identities, and lived experiences can find support, feel belonging, and thrive at work. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a multi-departmental function that should be integrated into the fabric of everything a company does, from product design to marketing to human resources and different policies and practices. Diversity, equity, inclusion centers the perspectives and challenges of people who are marginalized and underrepresented, going beyond the optics of tokenism and into true organizational transformation and growth. And what diversity, equity, inclusion requires largely is proactive education, leadership coaching, intentional policies and practices, and of course, long-term commitments, resources, and accountability to animate good intentions.
Great. I love that t-shirt example use case that you threw in there, right? Even to the way we dress. So I'm curious about in terms of like the adoption throughout the organizations, right? Do you see particular good practices or working groups internally being formed, or is this kind of like a little more voluntary within organizations?
That's such a good question. So I think the early phase of diversity, equity, inclusion at an organization is very volunteer-led. It's very passionate advocates, leading the charge. And we know that creates an equity because lots of people that are those volunteers that are doing this work off the side of their desk on top of different roles and responsibilities they have are usually also from marginalized and underrepresented communities. So we're basically asking for that additional labor of these folks, and it's uncompensated, and it's on top of everything else they're doing. So that's that initial phase. But then we want to move into, very leader-led diversity, equity, inclusion approaches that this is integrating into people's roles and responsibilities, like explicit percent allocation of their work should be dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion for particular roles. We want complete roles dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want being responsibilities and actions used to support diversity, equity, and inclusion to be, properly compensated and integrated into people's jobs. That would be where we want to go. And I'd say lots of organizations are at that initial phase where it's a little volunteer-led. They may be gone to the point where there's an official committee dedicated to it that has a regular meeting cadence and stuff like that, but they haven't gone to the point where it's like, oh, like this is something that should be integrated into almost any managerial or leadership role. There's goals that should be integrated into like key performance indicators and objectives and key results. How are we benchmarking and creating accountability and measuring that year-over-year progress? That's usually where we're trying to get organizations to go to. I'm sorry, I think you're maybe still on mute.
Sorry. So if we think about, good practices under like the whole responsible intelligence umbrella, with one form of being more on the bias and fairness behind it, right? Are there good practices that you would recommend to the organizations?
Yes, definitely, certainly. So when it comes to identifying the roots of bias, I think the biggest thing that organizations can do is to make sure they're involving a diverse group of stakeholders in their processes with a variety of backgrounds, identities, and lived experiences across race, gender, age, socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientation, sizes, abilities, disabilities, caregiving responsibilities, faiths, spiritualities, immigration statuses, and more. And this really helps ensure that a breadth of needs are considered. Uncovering bias also requires workplace cultures that prioritize psychological safety, where people feel safe to share constructive feedback and perspectives without fear of being reprimanded, of being like unceremoniously dismissed, or that they'll experience harm to their advancement opportunities. So you can have a room full of folks with important ideas and feedback to share that are awesome, that really expose biases maybe embedded in your product, in a certain process or practice that your organization's engaging in. But if they don't feel comfortable or empowered enough to actually share, these ideas and perspectives, then you don't ever reap those benefits. You don't ever really uncover those biases. Specifically regard to bias and product inclusion, companies should consider involving DEI specialists and consultants throughout the entire product journey, from ideation to prototyping to product launch and advertisements. And they should be intentional about having a diverse team of product developers initially, and have their products tested by a diverse group of beta testers and getting feedback from focus groups that were created with diversity in mind. There's definitely some specific ways that we can work to challenge algorithmic bias. Also, that's really being intentional about the data sets that you're using to train AI in those algorithms. And then finally, on an individual or interpersonal level, challenging bias means really interrogating what beliefs, experiences, and stereotypes that you're filtering different situations and actions through. So you have to earnestly consider why you're inferring or coming to specific conclusions, and really unpack that rather than rely on some vague intuition that's rooted in subjectivity. And that's really like the birthplace of bias, when we relegate different processes, products, all these different things to the realm of subjectivity or objective criteria and metrics and processes, or standardized at least. So when possible, you want to make sure that when you're making evaluations you're making them on specific and standardized criteria, not just personal sentiments. And that goes the same for decision making across a product journey, or as you're developing your team.
Great. So I guess double clicking on that a little bit, if you look at the organizations that you work with, is there a particular status quo or kind of average normal that you see across the industries, or is it really, depending on the companies you speak with, it's really all over the place?
It's definitely all over the place. Us at Feminuity, we definitely have an intake process that specifically interrogates whether the organization that we might work with, really is committed to this work. Are they just looking for a one-off workshop, or just a band-aid on these things, and not a fulsome transformation in what they're doing. So in our intake process, we're really trying to evaluate if the intentions are there, if the resources and commitments there for us to even take someone on as a client. But then once we're actually working with an organization, there's still a lot of variety of where their starting points are, I'd say, for sure. Some people are very okay, leading edge. They want to know the very next diversity, equity, inclusion thing. They've established lots of really foundational things that you need, such as maybe voluntary self-identification. And that's when you're collecting demographic characteristics across maybe users, applicants, your workplace employees in your workplace. So then analyze that data to understand gaps, growth areas, and moments of excellence, but to also benchmark and do year-over-year progress. And they're ready, for the next level. We've identified these issues. These are the specific issues that we're working with. But then there's some organizations that we're working with on assessments, and they're really in that identification phase. They're we really want you to come in as, unbiased, and, people that have a rigorous methodology around DEI, and help us understand what is going on in our workplace and what our main growth opportunities are, whether that be with specific regard to their product, their marketing, sentiments of their teams and workforces and specific departments. It really depends on the organization's needs.
So you work with a lot of different organizations, right? In terms of engagements, different horizons, right? For it, how is Feminuity helping kind of break down these barriers between maybe more myopic near-term ones to ones that might be a little further out, going towards the longer-term strategy that you mentioned earlier?
like how are we promoting like that more long-term like integrated strategy? So that's a great question. I feel like we definitely try to give as many resources as possible to our client to like help bring those like good intentions to fruition. We like start with like the baseline sorts of things that, you know, an organization needs, such as like voluntary self-identification and stuff like that. We recommend, you know, getting everyone on like a specific baseline with regard to like DEI education. So getting that whole workforce aligned on what it means, because there is still a lot of skepticism and trepidation around diversity, equity, inclusion. Some people don't understand that it's really to the benefit of everyone, that's really trying to create a workplace where everyone can thrive, and that all the unique intersections of identities that everyone has, everyone possesses like a myriad of identities, and everyone sits at the intersections of privileged identities and oppressed identities. So everyone has a stake in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But until you align your entire organization on the fact that this is for everyone, there's nothing to be threatened by. This is about creating fairness and about, you know, acknowledging these like long-term inequities that have been affecting folks, then that gets people, and I feel like, in the right headset to start advancing and scaling their DEI strategy. So I'd say education, some foundational leading practices, and then just, I guess, just like long-term relationships. Oftentimes you need to like ground these sorts of, you know, recommendations on like empirical like observations or data that we collect from the organization, so we can really illustrate our case for why they need the specific things that we're asking them to do.
Great. Really interesting there. I guess in terms of the training side that you mentioned, right? Do you think there's proper alignment? Like if you look at all the different companies that you've worked with, right? Are they actually in the proper education behind it? Or do you think we're pretty still far behind and we need to work on our progression?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. Like, sometimes we're doing literally a foundational workshop. Our foundational curriculum is level up. So we're just doing diversity, equity, inclusion foundations and diversity, equity, inclusion practice. That's really the primer into like, you know, the whole field, the whole orientation to like business and like some interpersonal and organizational strategies to, you know, help, you know, promote DEI. But then other times organizations are asking us for very tailored, you know, content. So we just recently hosted a workshop on product inclusion for technical developers at a specific organization. And there the interest was, oh, so how can we start to uncover those gaps and growth areas in our product? What are some key issues in tech, whether that be you know, the representation issues that we know that are enduring in the field, whether they be with regard to gender, race, disability, or membership in the LGBTQ2+ community. And that's just to name a few, or with the specific regard to algorithmic bias, or like how do we really be intentional about product inclusion? Product inclusion, I feel like, is a huge field. Google has a Google Accelerate Hub dedicated to product inclusion, which is pretty cool. And I feel like that's one of our favorite things to do at Feminuity, is really to reimagine products and consider, you know, the biases embedded within them and how we can make them more inclusive.
Yeah, it's interesting that product inclusion side specifically, right? You know, as designers are making these products behind them, and the machine learning user experience between AI as well behind that, right? Are we really being inclusive to how the end users are going to use that? Interesting. Is that something that Feminuity focuses on a lot, or is this kind of like a one-off that you get particular from customers?
In terms of product inclusion, it's definitely one of our core like offerings to different organizations. Like I would say it's like on par with other sort of services that we offer. We definitely do a lot of education. I'd say that's like a big thing that we do, but certainly we definitely like help with product inclusion, and we definitely do a lot of leadership coaching as well. So it's very varied for the organization. I think with tech in particular, you know, we're really scaling, you know, different technologies at warp speed, and you know, there's some like issues, you know, embedded within them that I feel like companies are looking to like uncover and think about more critically and earnestly. So definitely we're working a lot with that. They're definitely not one-off, but it's definitely not everything we do as well.
Correct. Interesting. I guess, is there a particular like story that you want to share behind maybe one of your use cases with customers while still keeping privacy involved?
Yes, let me think. So I guess like an easy like case is like, so we are like evaluating a product, and sometimes like basically the quickest wins, you know, for like a specific interface, like an app or something like that, aren't that hard to like implement. So maybe it's literally adjusting the language that you're using to better inclusive language, or instead of using he/she, using the singular they or passive voice, you know, acknowledge the gender diversity to not like reinforce their binary. Or when someone's designing a profile on their user face, like adding fields for chosen name and pronouns. So people can make sure they know they can share a name that's not their legal name, or have their pronouns visible on their profile so they don't need to be misgendered in any way. Or even evaluating, you know, the color contrast and the fonts, and perhaps even like the live captioning or transcription of different video content on an interface to make sure that it's accessible. So those sorts of things can be really critical. And I think also just knowing that how you approach certain issues, you know, can be really important if you're acknowledging inequity, you know, in a given thing, or it feels like you're glossing over or contributing to something that might be a harmful myth, or what am I thinking? Just something that might be more misinformation or might be taken as offensive to some folks.
Interesting. So I guess like you've worked with a lot of different personas and roles, right? From like your data scientist to your product-led folks to maybe like governance, right? So
Definitely.
I'm curious, across that spectrum, do you find any difficulty in working across those barriers? Are there particular areas that you need to kind of drill down on more than others?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like most importantly, you need diversity, equity, inclusion to be like leader led. So I feel like one of the most critical steps you can take initially is getting buy-in from a leadership team, making sure they're aligned on the foundational principles and like ideas and issues in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they, you know, are helping, you know, propel and like promote diversity, equity, inclusion at their organization. I think that in terms of just like the individual team member, I feel like sometimes something that's tough is like we can have all these good intentions around diversity, equity, inclusion. We can even communicate those, but if we're not embedding those into people's, you know, performance evaluations, their performance indicators, I feel like anyone, like, you're going to prioritize the things that actually bear weight on how you're going to be evaluated, or like, you know, advance within an organization. So there's people that have these diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. They're not embedded in how people are evaluated or what's being measured in terms of performance. So it's really, it kind of falls short at the good intentions and doesn't get operationalized properly. So team members, just like I think through a fault in the incentive structure, but also not understanding that DEI is as critical a function as whatever else they're doing, like, or maybe letting that fall by the wayside, you know, in service of things that they view as more like key functional areas.
Cool. So I guess we're closing up on time pretty soon. I guess before we check in with the audience, see if there are any questions, do you have any further takeaways and recommendations of where we go from here?
Yes, totally. So I think in terms to inclusion in tech, I want to urge developers using machine learning to train algorithms or like train AI with more intentionally curated data sets that represent the depth and breadth of different folks who will use or be affected by their product. And that we want products to be tested by a diverse group of stakeholders, and a fulsome bias assessment should be completed before any product launch. We also encourage people to consider the edge cases when designing products. So not just looking at the large trends and big data sets, but getting that meaning feedback from unique users, or even perhaps detractors from your product, can help create something that's monumentally more inclusive. So considering that one person with a specific disability that had value feedback around how interacting with your product was for them. We want people to go outside the myth of objectivity which surrounds technology, where we think that automating something or having it run by an algorithm means that bias is eliminated, where in actuality, some of these technologies might be amplifying existing inequities in startling ways, such as perhaps Amazon's resume screening algorithm, which they scrapped, which they found was screening out women's resumes based on these different proxy characteristics like women's colleges or stuff like that, because the algorithm was trained on a data set filled with men's resumes. So it was viewing, you know, aspects that were more predominantly found in women's resumes as undesirable and screening those out. Next, we want to always be mindful of the shadow side of tech and the potential of our technologies being weaponized for purposes outside their intended use, such as smart home technology being used for smart abuse, or facial recognition technology being used to ignore due process and law enforcement, or implement a surveillance state and certain authoritarian regimes. Or that we increasingly know, and this is really relevant to current events, how different social media platforms will stoke division and resentment for the sake of user engagement with the platform, which increases ad performance. And finally, we want to ask ourselves about the immense power of tech to create a better world. So how can we better center social impact in tech and go beyond profitability, but create tech that's in service of more equitable and inclusive society? That might be the question to start out with, and that's under discussed in the field at the moment. We need the fun tech projects with potentials to promote justice. So that would be my parting words on, creating more ethical and inclusive AI.
Sounds great. So I'm just checking to see if we got any questions coming in from the audience. If not, I'd like to kind of dive into a couple other ones. Just have a few minutes left. Let's see, we got something coming in. I'm still typing, but okay, here's one. Okay, no questions yet. All right, so I guess in terms of the user feedback that you were mentioning here, do you find that people are testing the feedback with the audiences early on, or is it something that comes in where they're going to develop it, get everything right, and then they'll test it with the appropriate audience at a much later stage? So it's not really like a first-class citizen.
See, that's what we're trying to get organization more towards. It's like implementing that bias assessment and diversity, equity, inclusion considerations throughout the whole product journey, even like product ideation phase. But yes, there's sometimes we're getting to the end, like organizations are still at, this isn't a must to have, this is a nice to have. So it's like something at like one of the closer to the stages of product development, they're finally, getting that critical feedback or like doing those bias assessments. When if we do them earlier, it makes everything, I think, a lot easier and the whole trajectory of something.
Yeah, interesting. So like if I look at like, one of these kind of Gartner hype cycle trends, right? And you've seen like the whole ethical framework from more the data scientists, but even down to a lot of the users and organizations, right? Do you see kind of an uptick of organizations being able to spend, this is where we should be spending more time now, not later, like taking action now?
No, well, I think, yeah, there's definitely been a surge of organizations seeking these perspectives. I think there's been a lot of different events that have like elevated the profile of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly considering these sorts of things in tech. We had the recent, Facebook controversy in the media, but even before that, I think, global unrest due to the Black Lives Matter and the injustice affecting, Black lives, by law enforcement and other different oppressed forces. That was like an incredible impetus, I think, for people to invest more earnestly in diversity, equity, inclusion in a watershed moment. I think even, the riots in the United States around the Capitol and stuff like that have been like impetuses to like invest in DEI. So I feel like DEI and like people's, I think, investment in it and questions around it, even with regard to like their products and stuff like that, can be incredibly influenced by, I feel, current events. But what we want people to move towards like a more, standardized long-term commitment year over year, which I feel like that's where the field's moving towards. But I feel like largely lots of current events are what are the impetus, or like some passion advocates at an organization are the impetus to these sorts of questions. And we see other organizations almost opting out of these conversations. Like on the flip side, Coinbase releasing, saying we are not a political organization, and we kind of opt out of these things. Not that that's really possible. We know from feminists, insights that the personal is political, and you can't just divorce yourself to anything that's considered political or anything that might, require us to interrogate privilege or seek better justice.
Sounds great. It's all good information. Thanks a lot. So just out of time now. So I think we'll go ahead and depart, but thanks a lot for your time, Keith.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.